The smell of gunpowder mixed with blood filled the air as explosions shook the earth beneath her feet. Private Sarah Chun pressed her back against the concrete wall, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the constant rattle of machine gun fire. Just 20 meters away, her commanding officer lay motionless in the open street, blood pooling around his uniform. Everyone said it was suicide to go out there. The enemy had the entire area surrounded, and anyone who stepped into that killing zone wouldn't make it back alive. But as Sarah watched her commander's chest barely rising and falling, she knew she had only one choice. What she did next would not only save a life, but change military history forever. Her actions in those next few minutes would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, leadership, and what it truly means to serve your country. This is the story of a moment that proved heroes aren't born from rank or training, but from the simple decision to do what's right when everything else is wrong. Sarah Chun never imagined she would find herself in the middle of a war zone when she first enlisted in the Army 3 years ago. Back then, she was just a 19-year-old girl from a small town in Ohio, looking for a way to pay for college and maybe see a bit of the world. Her parents had been against it from the start. Her mother cried for weeks, and her father barely spoke to her the day she left for basic training. Growing up, Sarah had always been the quiet one in her family. She wasn't the star athlete like her older brother or the brilliant student like her younger sister. She was just Sarah, the middle child who helped her grandmother with grocery shopping and spent her free time reading books about faraway places. When she told her family she wanted to join the military, they thought she had lost her mind. Basic training was nothing like what Sarah had expected. The drill sergeants were tougher than any teacher she had ever met, and the physical demands pushed her body to limits she didn't know existed. Many nights, she would lie in her narrow bunk bed, listening to some of the other recruits cry themselves to sleep, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But something inside Sarah refused to give up. Maybe it was her grandmother's voice in her head, always telling her that Chin women were stronger than they looked. Maybe it was the desire to prove to everyone back home that she was more than just the quiet girl who never caused any trouble. Whatever it was, Sarah pushed through every challenge, every humiliation, every moment when she wanted to quit and go home. When she graduated from basic training, Sarah felt like a different person. She stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and had muscles she never knew she could develop. Her parents came to the graduation ceremony, and for the first time in months, she saw pride in their eyes. Her father, a man who rarely showed emotion, hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe. Sarah's first assignment was to Fort Henderson, a military base in North Carolina where she would receive advanced training in communications. She learned how to operate complex radio systems, coordinate between different units, and maintain communication links during combat operations. The work was technical and demanding, but Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for it. Her instructors noticed her dedication and skill, and within a year, she was recommended for overseas deployment. The deployment came sooner than anyone expected. Tensions in Eastern Europe had been escalating for months, and suddenly, Sarah found herself on a transport plane heading toward a conflict zone she had only read about in newspapers. She was assigned to the 42nd Communications Battalion under the command of Major David Rodriguez, a decorated officer with 15 years of experience and a reputation for never leaving a soldier behind. Major Rodriguez was not what Sarah had expected in a commanding officer. He was shorter than most of the men in their unit, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. Where other officers might bark orders and demand immediate compliance, Rodriguez took time to explain the reasoning behind his decisions. He knew every soldier's name, asked about their families, and genuinely seemed to care about their well-being. During their first briefing, Rodriguez looked directly at each member of his team and said something that would stick with Sarah for the rest of her life. "We are not just soldiers," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We are guardians of each other. Every decision we make, every action we take, should be guided by one simple principle. We all go home together." The base where they were stationed was located in a valley surrounded by hills, about 30 kilometers from the front lines of the conflict. It was a strategic communication hub, responsible for coordinating between various military units spread across the region. The work was intense, with 12-hour shifts and constant pressure to maintain contact with units in dangerous areas. Sarah quickly proved herself to be an invaluable member of the team. She had an unusual ability to troubleshoot communication problems under pressure, and her calm demeanor helped keep everyone focused during stressful situations. Rodriguez began relying on her more and more, often asking for her input on technical decisions that would normally be handled by more senior personnel. The first few months of deployment passed relatively peacefully. There were occasional reports of skirmishes in distant areas, but the base itself remained secure. Sarah settled into a routine of work, meals, and letters home. She wrote to her grandmother every week, describing the landscape, the food, and the interesting people she met from all over the country. But peace in a war zone is always temporary. Intelligence reports began indicating increased enemy activity in their region. Supply convoys started requiring armed escorts, and patrol schedules were increased. The atmosphere on the base grew tense as everyone prepared for the possibility that the conflict might come to them. Rodriguez called more frequent briefings, reviewing evacuation procedures and emergency protocols. He insisted on additional training exercises, pushing his team to practice their responses to various scenarios. Some of the soldiers grumbled about the extra work, but Sarah understood the importance of being prepared. The first real sign of danger came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Sarah was monitoring radio communications when she picked up fragmentary reports of an attack on a supply convoy just 15 kilometers from their position. The reports were confusing and contradictory, but it was clear that something significant was happening. Rodriguez rushed into the communications center, his usual calm demeanor replaced by focused intensity. "What do we know?" he asked, scanning the multiple screens and radio sets that filled the room. Sarah handed him a transcript of the radio call she had intercepted. "Convoy Delta 7 came under attack at approximately 0800 hours, she reported. Initial reports suggested multiple casualties, but communications have been sporadic. They requested immediate medical evacuation and additional security support." For the next 6 hours, Sarah and her team worked nonstop to coordinate the rescue operation. They maintained contact with medical helicopters, guided ground units to the attack site, and provided real-time intelligence updates to command headquarters. It was exactly the kind of high-pressure situation they had trained for, and everyone performed flawlessly. The convoy was eventually rescued, and most of the soldiers were evacuated to safety. But the attack represented a significant escalation in enemy activity. Intelligence analysts concluded that hostile forces were moving closer to their position and becoming more aggressive in their tactics. Rodriguez gathered his team that evening for an emergency meeting. "The situation in our area has changed," he said, his expression serious. "We need to be prepared for the possibility of direct attack on our position. I want everyone to review our defensive procedures and emergency protocols." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to Rodriguez's words. This was what they had trained for, but the reality of potential combat was very different from practice exercises. She thought about her family back home, probably sitting down to dinner and watching television, completely unaware of the dangerous situation their daughter was facing. Over the next few days, the base implemented additional security measures. Guard rotations were increased, and everyone was required to carry their weapons at all times. The normal routine of military life continued, but underneath the surface, everyone could feel the tension building. Sarah found herself spending more time in the communications center, monitoring radio traffic for any signs of incoming threats. She had developed an almost intuitive understanding of the various radio codes and signal patterns used by both friendly and enemy forces. Rodriguez often came to her for her assessment of the tactical situation, trusting her judgment about what they were hearing on the airwaves. The attack came without warning on a Friday evening, just as the dinner shift was beginning. Sarah was in the communications center, updating the daily status reports, when the first explosion shook the building. The lights flickered, and several pieces of equipment fell from their mounting brackets. Rodriguez burst through the door, already wearing his combat gear. "Contact all units. he shouted over the sound of another explosion. "We're under attack. Implement emergency procedures immediately." Sarah's training took over, and she began working the radios with practiced efficiency. She contacted headquarters to report the attack, called for immediate air support, and coordinated with the base's defensive units. Outside, she could hear the sound of small arms fire growing closer and more intense. For the next hour, the base was caught in a fierce battle. Enemy forces had somehow managed to get close to the perimeter without being detected, and they were attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The defenders fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. Rodriguez moved constantly throughout the base, checking on different defensive positions and making tactical decisions. Sarah maintained communications from the command center, providing him with updates on the overall situation and relaying his orders to various units. As the battle intensified, it became clear that the enemy's PR of the radio crackled with static as Sarah tried to maintain contact with the various units scattered around the base perimeter. Outside, the sound of gunfire had grown more intense, punctuated by the occasional explosion that made the entire building shake. She had lost contact with 3 defensive positions in the last 20 minutes, and the reports she was receiving painted an increasingly desperate picture. Rodriguez had been gone for over an hour with his counterattack team, and Sarah hadn't heard from them since they left the communications center. She had tried calling them several times on their designated frequency, but received only silence in response. The knot in her stomach grew tighter with each failed attempt to reach him. Sergeant Miller, the senior non-commissioned officer in the communications center, paced nervously between the radio stations. He was a veteran with 10 years of experience, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes as he listened to the deteriorating situation reports coming in from around the base. "Private Chun," Miller called out. "Any word from Major Rodriguez's team?" Sarah shook her head, her fingers moving automatically across the radio controls as she tried different frequencies. "Nothing, Sergeant. I've been monitoring their primary and backup channels, but there's been no response for the last 45 minutes. Miller cursed under his breath and moved to the window, peering through the reinforced glass into the darkness beyond. The base's perimeter lighting had been knocked out early in the attack, leaving only the occasional muzzle flash or explosion to illuminate the battlefield. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah's communications equipment allowed her to monitor not just their own units, but also fragments of enemy radio traffic. Her language training had included basic understanding of the hostile forces' communication patterns, and what she was hearing suggested that they were preparing for a final assault on the command center. A new voice suddenly broke through the static on Rodriguez's frequency. "Command center, this is Bravo 7. We have casualties and need immediate medical evacuation." Sarah grabbed the microphone. "Bravo 7, this is command center. What's your status?" "We're pinned down approximately 200 meters northeast of your position," the voice replied, strain evident in every word. "Major Rodriguez is down. Repeat, Major Rodriguez is wounded and unconscious. We need medical support immediately." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Rodriguez wounded and unconscious meant their unit had lost its commanding officer in the middle of a battle. It also meant that someone needed to make the decision about whether to attempt a rescue mission in the middle of an active combat zone. Sergeant Miller had heard the transmission and rushed over to Sarah's station. "Give me exact coordinates," he ordered, "and find out how many casualties they have." Sarah worked the radio, gathering information from the stranded team. What she learned made the situation even worse. Rodriguez had been hit by shrapnel from an enemy grenade, and he was unconscious and bleeding heavily. 2 other soldiers had been wounded, and the entire team was trapped behind minimal cover with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. The medical evacuation team reported that they couldn't reach the wounded soldier's position due to heavy enemy fire. The route to their location led through an open area that enemy snipers had covered. Any rescue attempt would require someone to cross that killing zone under direct fire. Miller studied the tactical map, calculating distances and trying to determine the best approach for a rescue mission. "We need to get a team together," he said, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Miller was an experienced communications specialist, But he wasn't trained for combat operations, and most of the base's infantry soldiers were already engaged in defending the perimeter. Sarah stared at the map, memorizing the location where Rodriguez and his team were trapped. The distance wasn't far, maybe 200 meters, but those 200 meters included the open courtyard where enemy forces had concentrated their fire. She thought about Rodriguez's words before he left. "Make sure you get our people home." As if reading her thoughts, Miller shook his head. "Don't even think about it, Chun. You're a communications specialist, not infantry. Going out there would be suicide." But Sarah was already calculating the risks in her mind. She knew the base layout better than most people because she had spent so much time studying the tactical maps for her communications work. She also knew that every minute they waited increased the chances that Rodriguez would bleed to death from his injuries. Another explosion, much closer than the previous ones, shook the building and knocked out power to half of their radio equipment. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the communications center in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, Sarah could see flames rising from one of the nearby buildings. "Command Center, this is Bravo 7. The radio crackled again. "Major Rodriguez's condition is deteriorating. We need medical evacuation now, or we're going to lose him." Miller grabbed the microphone. "Bravo 7, hold your position. We're working on getting help to you." But even as he said the words, both Sarah and Miller knew that help wasn't coming. The medical team couldn't reach them, and there weren't enough unengaged soldiers available to mount a proper rescue operation. Unless something changed dramatically in the next few minutes, Rodriguez and his team were going to die. Sarah looked around the communications center at the sophisticated radio equipment that connected their small base to military units around the world. She thought about all the training she had received, all the procedures she had memorized, all the protocols designed to handle every possible situation. But none of that training had prepared her for the simple reality that sometimes the only option was for someone to make an impossible choice. She stood up from her radio station and walked over to the equipment locker where the emergency medical supplies were stored. Miller watched her with growing alarm as she began gathering first aid equipment and stuffing it into a military medical bag. "Chun, what do you think you're doing?" Miller demanded. "Major Rodriguez saved my life more than once during our deployment," Sarah replied, checking the contents of the medical bag. "He never left anyone behind. And I'm not going to start now." Miller stepped between Sarah and the door. "I can't let you do this. You're not trained for combat operations, and you'd be crossing an active battlefield with no support. It's not just dangerous, it's impossible." Sarah looked at Miller, and for a moment, she felt the same fear that was evident in his eyes. Everything he was saying was true. She wasn't infantry. She hadn't been trained for this kind of mission. The chances of her making it to Rodriguez's position, treating his wounds, and getting him back safely were incredibly small. But she also knew that if she didn't try, Rodriguez would definitely die. The man who had taken time to learn every soldier's name, who had insisted that they all go home together, who had shown her what real leadership looked like, was lying wounded in the darkness, depending on someone to make the choice between safety and doing what was right. "Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "Major Rodriguez risked his life to protect this base and everyone on it. The least I can do is risk mine to get him home." Miller stared at her for a long moment, clearly torn between his duty to prevent her from undertaking a suicide mission and his respect for her determination to save their commanding officer. Finally, he stepped aside. "If you're really going to do this," he said, "you'll need more than medical supplies." Miller led Sarah to another equipment locker and pulled out a flak vest, helmet, and additional ammunition for her sidearm. As she put on the protective gear, he briefed her on what he knew about enemy positions and the safest route to reach Rodriguez's team. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, making sure she had everything she needed for the mission. The medical bag contained bandages, blood clotting agents, pain medication, and other supplies necessary to treat serious trauma wounds. Her radio was tuned to the command frequency, so she could maintain contact with the communications center. As she prepared to leave, Miller grabbed her arm. "Chun," he said, his voice serious, "if the situation becomes impossible out there, don't try to be a hero. Get yourself back here alive. Rodriguez wouldn't want you to die trying to save him." Sarah nodded. understanding Miller's concern but knowing that she was already committed to seeing this mission through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. She approached the exit from the communications center, and Miller positioned himself at the radio to provide whatever support he could. Sarah could hear the continuing sound of gunfire from multiple directions, and she knew that the moment she stepped outside, she would become a target for any enemy forces in the area. Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened the door and stepped into the chaos of the battlefield. The smell of gunpowder and smoke immediately filled her nostrils, and the sound of weapons fire became much more intense without the protection of the building walls. The route to Rodriguez's position led across an open courtyard that was illuminated periodically by muzzle flashes and explosions. Sarah could see the darker shadows of buildings and defensive positions around the perimeter, but she couldn't tell which ones contained friendly forces and which might be occupied by the enemy. Sarah crouched behind a concrete barrier at the edge of the courtyard, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the enemy could hear it over the gunfire. The medical bag felt heavier with each passing second, and her hands were shaking as she checked her equipment one final time. 50 meters of open ground stretched before her, lit occasionally by muzzle flashes that revealed the deadly crossfire waiting for anyone brave enough to cross. She pressed her radio earpiece and whispered into the microphone. "Command Center, this is Chun. I'm at the courtyard entrance. Beginning movement to Bravo 7's position." Miller's voice crackled back through the static. "Copy, Chun. Be advised, we're tracking at least 3 enemy positions with direct line of sight to your route. Watch for sniper fire from the water tower." Sarah looked up at the water tower Miller had mentioned and could see the faint outline of what might be a rifle barrel protruding from behind the structure. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly to cover the courtyard, making any rescue attempt seem impossible. Taking a deep breath, Sarah reminded herself of everything Rodriguez had taught her about leadership and sacrifice. He had never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and now she was following his example, even if it meant putting her own life at risk. She waited for a lull in the gunfire, counting the seconds between bursts to identify a pattern. Enemy weapons needed time to reload, and if she could time her movement correctly, she might be able to cross the open ground during one of those brief pauses. The opportunity came sooner than expected. An explosion somewhere on the eastern side of the base drew the attention of the enemy gunners, and, for a moment, the fire directed at the courtyard decreased significantly. Sarah knew this was her chance. She sprinted from behind the concrete barrier, running in a zigzag pattern toward the building where Rodriguez was trapped. Her military training had taught her to stay low and keep moving, making herself as difficult a target as possible. The medical bag bounced against her side with each step, and she could hear bullets whining past her ears as the enemy spotted her movement. Halfway across the courtyard, Sarah's luck ran out. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from the water tower, and she felt a bullet tear through the fabric of her uniform, missing her ribs by inches. She dove behind a damaged vehicle that provided minimal cover, breathing heavily as more bullets struck the metal around her. "Command Center," she whispered into her radio. "I'm pinned down behind the blue truck. Heavy fire from multiple positions. Can you make it back?" Miller's voice responded immediately. Sarah looked at the remaining distance to Rodriguez's position, then back at the route she had just crossed. Going back would be just as dangerous as continuing forward, and Rodriguez didn't have time for her to wait for the situation to improve. "Negative," she replied, continuing to objective. Before Miller could protest, Sarah switched off her radio to avoid giving away her position with any additional transmissions. She studied the remaining ground between her current cover and the building where Bravo 7 was trapped, looking for anything that might provide concealment during the final approach. A series of concrete planters created a broken line of cover leading most of the way to her destination. If she could move quickly from one to the next, she might be able to avoid the concentrated fire that had nearly killed her in the open courtyard. Sarah waited for another explosion to distract the enemy gunners, then made her move. She sprinted to the first planter as bullets sparked off the concrete around her feet. The enemy was tracking her movement now, anticipating where she would go next and concentrating their fire accordingly. From the first planter to the second, Sarah felt a bullet tug at her sleeve, close enough to burn the skin beneath the fabric. Her helmet was struck by something that might have been a ricochet, sending a sharp ringing through her ears. But she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that Rodriguez's life depended on her reaching him. The third sprint was the longest, requiring her to cross an open space where two enemy positions could target her simultaneously. Sarah ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning as bullets kicked up dust and concrete chips around her feet. A round struck the medical bag, tearing through the canvas but somehow missing the vital supplies inside. Finally, after what felt like hours but had probably been less than 2 minutes, Sarah dove behind the wall of the building where Rodriguez was trapped. She pressed herself against the concrete, gasping for breath and trying to process the fact that she had somehow made it across the killing zone alive. "Bravo 7, she called out in a loud whisper. "This is Private Chen from Communications. What's your position?" A voice responded from somewhere nearby. "Chen? What the hell are you doing here?" Following the voice, Sarah found Corporal Jackson, one of Rodriguez's team members, crouched behind a low wall with his rifle trained on the enemy positions. His left arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and Sarah could see blood seeping through the fabric. "Where's Major Rodriguez?" Sarah asked, dropping down beside Jackson. Jackson pointed toward a nearby doorway where Sarah could see two figures huddled in the shadows. "He's over there with Martinez. Hit by shrapnel from a grenade about an hour ago. Lost consciousness 20 minutes later. Martinez is trying to keep pressure on the wound, but we don't have proper medical supplies." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and crawled toward the doorway, keeping low to avoid exposing herself to enemy fire. She found Rodriguez lying on his side, his uniform torn and bloody around his right shoulder and chest. Private Martinez was kneeling beside him, pressing a wadded-up shirt against the worst of the wounds. "How's he doing?" Sarah asked Martinez as she opened her medical bag and began assessing Rodriguez's condition. "Not good," Martinez replied, his voice tight with worry. "He's lost a lot of blood, and he keeps going in and out of consciousness. I don't think that shirt is doing much to stop the bleeding." Sarah had received basic medical training as part of her military preparation, but treating severe trauma wounds in the middle of a combat zone was far beyond anything she had practiced. Still, she had watched enough medical procedures during her deployment to understand the basics of wound care. She carefully removed Martinez's makeshift bandage and examined Rodriguez's injuries. The shrapnel had created several deep lacerations, and one piece of metal was still embedded in his shoulder. Blood was flowing steadily from the wounds, and Rodriguez's face was pale and clammy to the touch. Working as quickly as possible, Sarah cleaned the wounds with antiseptic solution and applied blood-clotting agents to slow the bleeding. She couldn't remove the embedded shrapnel without risking more severe damage, so she carefully bandaged around it to stabilize the metal fragment. As she worked, Rodriguez's eyes flickered open, and he looked up at her with confusion. "Chun," he whispered weakly. "What are you doing here?" "Keeping my promise, sir," Sarah replied, continuing to work on his wounds. "You said we all go home together, remember?" Rodriguez tried to sit up, but Sarah gently pushed him back down. "You need to stay still, Major. You've lost a lot of blood, and moving around will make it worse." "The mission," Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible. "Did we complete the mission?" Sarah looked around at the 3 wounded soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, with no clear way to get back to safety, and realized that the original mission was now irrelevant. Their new mission was simply to survive until help could reach them or until they could find a way to extract themselves. "The mission has changed, sir," she said, applying the final bandage to his shoulder. "Now we just need to get everyone home safe." Jackson crawled over to their position, keeping his rifle ready. "Chun, I hate to interrupt the medical work, but we've got movement on the eastern approach. Looks like they're setting up for another assault." Sarah looked through a crack in the wall and could see shadowy figures moving between buildings in the distance. The enemy was repositioning for what appeared to be a final attack on their position, probably hoping to overrun them before any rescue could arrive. "How much ammunition do we have?" Sarah asked. Jackson and Martinez quickly checked their weapons and remaining supplies. The answer was not encouraging. Between the 3 of them, They had enough ammunition for maybe 10 minutes of sustained fighting. After that, they would be defenseless against any enemy assault. Jackson stared at Sarah with disbelief written across his dirt-streaked face. Chun, you can't be serious. You're talking about holding off an entire enemy assault team by yourself with just a sidearm. That's not buying us time. That's suicide. Sarah was already moving, positioning herself near a window that provided a clear view of the enemy's likely approach routes. She had counted at least 8 hostile fighters moving into position, all of them better armed and more experienced than she was. But sometimes, she realized, the most important battles weren't won by superior firepower or tactical advantage. Sometimes they were won by someone being willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for their fellow soldiers. Rodriguez taught me that leadership isn't about rank or training, Sarah said, checking her weapon one more time. It's about making the hard choices when no one else can make them. Right now, that choice is mine to make. Martinez had fashioned a stretcher from equipment straps and pieces of debris, and he and Jackson were preparing to move Rodriguez. The Major was drifting in and out of consciousness, but during his lucid moments, he seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Sir, Sarah knelt beside Rodriguez and spoke quietly. Jackson and Martinez are going to get you back to the medical center. I'm going to provide cover for your withdrawal. Rodriguez's eyes focused on her with effort. Chun, he whispered, that's not an order. You don't have to do this. Sarah smiled, remembering the 19-year-old girl who had left Ohio 3 years ago, unsure of her place in the world. I know, sir. That's what makes it the right thing to do. As Jackson and Martinez lifted Rodriguez onto the makeshift stretcher, Sarah moved to her defensive position. The enemy was approximately 50 meters away, using the same buildings and cover that had protected them earlier. She could hear voices calling out in a foreign language, coordinating their final assault. Give me exactly 5 minutes, Sarah told Jackson. After that, don't look back, no matter what you hear. Jackson hesitated at the doorway, clearly struggling with the decision to leave Sarah alone. Chun, there has to be another way. We could all make a run for it together. Rodriguez can't run, and carrying him will slow all of you down enough for the enemy to catch up, Sarah replied, taking aim through the window. This is the only way everyone gets home alive. The first enemy soldier appeared at the edge of her field of view, moving carefully between cover positions as he advanced toward their building. Sarah forced herself to wait, letting him get closer. She would only get a few shots before they identified her position and concentrated their fire, so every shot had to count. When the soldier reached the midpoint of the open area, Sarah fired. Her first shot struck him in the chest, and he collapsed behind a concrete barrier. Immediately, the other enemy fighters began firing at the building, forcing Sarah to duck below the window as bullets shattered the glass above her head. Go now, she shouted to Jackson and Martinez, who were already moving Rodriguez toward the back exit. Don't stop for anything. Sarah waited for a brief pause in the incoming fire, then moved to a different window and fired 2 more shots at enemy positions. She wasn't trying to hit specific targets now. She was trying to keep their attention focused on her position while Jackson's team escaped. The enemy fighters were experienced and well-trained. Within minutes of her first shot, they had identified her general location and begun coordinating a systematic assault on the building. Sarah could hear them calling out positions and movements, working together to surround her location from multiple directions. She moved constantly throughout the ground floor, firing from different windows and doorways to create the impression that there were multiple defenders in the building. The tactic worked for several minutes, forcing the enemy to advance more cautiously than they otherwise might have. But Sarah's ammunition was running low, and she knew that the enemy would soon realize they were facing a single defender. When that happened, they would rush the building from all directions simultaneously, and her delaying action would be over. Through a rear window, she caught a glimpse of Jackson and Martinez carrying Rodriguez across the courtyard toward the communications center. They were moving as fast as possible, but they still had at least 2 minutes of open ground to cover before reaching safety. A grenade exploded just outside the building, close enough to shower Sarah with debris and fill the air with choking dust. The enemy was escalating their assault, using explosives to clear the way for their final advance. Sarah knew she had maybe 30 seconds before they breached the building. She fired her last 2 shots through the front window, then drew her backup weapon, a small pistol that had been part of her standard equipment. It held fewer rounds than her primary sidearm, but it would have to be enough to buy Jackson's team the final minute they needed. The first enemy soldier burst through the front doorway, just as Sarah moved to a new position near the back of the building. She fired twice, forcing him to take cover, but 2 more fighters immediately followed him through the entrance. The building was being overrun, and Sarah's options were disappearing rapidly. She grabbed a smoke grenade from her equipment belt, pulled the pin, and threw it toward the front of the building. Dense white smoke began filling the interior space, providing concealment, but also making it difficult for Sarah to see her targets. Through the chaos of gunfire and smoke, Sarah heard a sound that made her heart leap with hope, the distant whine of helicopter rotors approaching the base. Air support was finally arriving, which meant that help was on the way for the defenders. If she could hold out for just a little longer, the entire tactical situation might change. But the enemy fighters in the building with her were pressing their assault, moving through the smoke-filled rooms and searching for her position. Sarah could hear their voices getting closer, and she knew that they would find her within the next minute or two. She fired her remaining shots at muzzle flashes moving through the smoke, then dropped the empty weapon and prepared to make her final stand with whatever improvised weapons she could find. A piece of broken metal from the grenade explosion became a makeshift knife, and she positioned herself near a doorway where she could ambush the next enemy fighter to enter. The sound of helicopters was getting louder, and through the smoke Sarah could see bright lights beginning to illuminate the courtyard outside. But she also heard footsteps approaching her position, and she knew that the enemy had almost found her. A figure emerged from the smoke just meters away, rifle raised, and searching for targets. Sarah launched herself from her concealed position, using the metal fragment to strike at the weapon before the soldier could fire. They went down together in a tangle of arms and equipment, fighting desperately for control of the rifle. Sarah's smaller size was a disadvantage in the physical struggle, but her determination gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She managed to knock the rifle away from both of them, and the fight became a contest of pure willpower and survival instinct. Just as the enemy soldier gained the upper hand and reached for a sidearm, the distinctive sound of American military weapons erupted from multiple directions around the building. The cavalry had arrived in the form of the base's quick reaction force, supported by helicopter gunships that were engaging enemy positions throughout the area. The soldier Sarah was fighting with suddenly released his grip and tried to flee toward the back of the building, but he was met by Jackson and 3 other American soldiers who had returned with the rescue team. The brief firefight was over in seconds, and suddenly, the building was secure. Sarah sat up slowly, her entire body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Her uniform was torn and dirty, and she had cuts and bruises from the fight, but she was alive. More importantly, she had bought enough time for Rodriguez to reach medical care and for the rescue force to arrive. Jackson rushed over to help her to her feet. "Chun, you crazy, magnificent soldier," he said, grinning despite the soot and blood covering his face. "You actually did it. You held them off long enough for the cavalry to get here." Through the broken windows, Sarah could see the helicopter gunships systematically destroying the remaining enemy positions around the base perimeter. The assault had been broken, and the immediate threat was over. "Rodriguez?" she asked, still trying to catch her breath. "Safe," Jackson replied. "The medics got to him in time. He's unconscious, but they think he's going to make it." As they walked outside into the courtyard, now brilliantly lit by the helicopter searchlights, Sarah felt a strange sense of unreality about what had just happened. A few hours ago, she had been a communications specialist monitoring radio traffic. Now she was walking away from a single-handed delaying action that had saved the lives of her commanding officer and fellow soldiers. But as she looked around at the damage from the battle and thought about the enemy soldiers who had died in the building behind her, Sarah realized that what she had done wasn't really about heroism or glory. It was simply about the choice to put others before herself when that choice mattered most. Rodriguez had been right when he said that they all go home together. Sometimes, Sarah now understood, Making sure everyone gets home requires someone to risk everything, even when the odds of success seem impossible. The weeks following the battle passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and paperwork that seemed to multiply faster than Sarah could complete it. The base had been secured and reinforced, but the psychological impact of the attack lingered in the exhausted faces of soldiers who had survived their first real taste of combat. Sarah found herself struggling with unexpected emotions as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had taken human lives during the battle, a fact that no amount of military training could have prepared her for emotionally. The faces of the enemy soldiers haunted her dreams, and she wondered if the weight of those decisions would ever become easier to bear. Major Rodriguez had been evacuated to a military hospital in Germany, where surgeons worked for 8 hours to remove shrapnel and repair damage to his shoulder and chest. The doctors said he would recover fully, but it would be months before he could return to active duty. In the meantime, the unit operated under temporary command while everyone tried to process what had happened during those chaotic hours. The official after-action reports described the battle in clinical military language that somehow failed to capture the terror, confusion, and split-second decisions that had determined who lived and who died. Sarah read through her own report multiple times, struck by how inadequate words seemed when trying to explain the moment she decided to cross that courtyard under fire. 3 weeks after the battle, Sarah was called to a meeting with Colonel Harrison, the base commander, and several other senior officers she didn't recognize. She reported to the conference room in her dress uniform, uncertain about what to expect but hoping it wouldn't be another round of questions about her decision-making process during the rescue operation. Colonel Harrison was a career infantry officer with 22 years of experience and a reputation for straight talk. He had interviewed Sarah twice already as part of the official investigation into the battle, but his expression suggested this meeting was different. "Private Chun," Harrison began, "I want to start by telling you that the preliminary investigation into your actions during the enemy assault has been completed. The findings have been forwarded to higher headquarters, and I expect we'll be hearing back from them soon." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Military investigations could result in anything from commendations to court-martial proceedings, depending on whether her superiors viewed her actions as heroic or as dangerous deviation from established procedures. "Sir," she replied carefully, "I understand that my decision to leave the communications center may have violated standard operating procedures. I'm prepared to accept responsibility for my actions." Harrison looked at the other officers in the room, and Sarah caught what might have been the hint of a smile. "Private Chun," he continued, "you're absolutely right that you violated standard procedures. Communications specialists are not supposed to undertake solo rescue missions in active combat zones. They're certainly not supposed to engage in single-handed delaying actions against superior enemy forces." Sarah's heart sank as she prepared for the consequences of her actions. She had known when she made the decision to rescue Rodriguez that she might face disciplinary action, but she had hoped that the successful outcome might mitigate any punishment. "However," Harrison continued, "there are occasions when violating procedures in order to save lives and complete the mission represents the highest form of military service. Your actions during the assault demonstrated initiative, courage, and leadership that exceeded anything we could have expected from a soldier at your rank and experience level." One of the other officers in the room, a woman Sarah didn't recognize, opened a folder and removed several documents. "Private Chun," she said, "I'm Colonel Martinez from Personnel Command. I'm here to discuss some significant changes to your military career path that have been recommended as a result of your performance during the battle." Sarah felt confused as she tried to process what she was hearing. She had expected punishment, not career advancement discussions. Colonel Martinez continued, "Your actions have attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. The combination of technical expertise, tactical thinking, and personal courage you demonstrated has led to several recommendations for accelerated promotion and specialized training opportunities." Furthermore, Colonel Harrison added, "Major Rodriguez has submitted a formal recommendation that you be awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. That recommendation has been endorsed by everyone in your chain of command and is currently being reviewed by the Pentagon." Sarah felt her knees go weak as she tried to comprehend what she was hearing. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor, awarded to soldiers who displayed exceptional courage in combat. The idea that her actions might be considered worthy of such recognition seemed impossible. "Sir," she said, struggling to find her voice, "I was just doing what needed to be done. Major Rodriguez and the others were wounded and trapped, and someone had to help them." "Private Chun," Colonel Martinez replied, "that attitude is exactly why you're being considered for these opportunities. The military needs leaders who understand that doing what needs to be done sometimes means ignoring what you're supposed to do." Over the next hour, the officers outlined several paths that were now available to Sarah's military career. She could apply for officer candidate school and become a commissioned officer. She could transfer to specialized units that valued her combination of technical skills and combat leadership. She could even apply for advanced training programs that would prepare her for high-level intelligence and communications work. But the most surprising opportunity came at the end of the meeting, when Colonel Harrison handed her a sealed envelope marked with the Pentagon seal. "This," he said, "is an invitation to participate in a new experimental program that's being developed based partly on your performance during the battle. The military has realized that traditional role distinctions may be less important than individual capability and judgment." Sarah opened the envelope and read the letter inside, trying to understand the formal military language that described something called the Integrated Combat Operations Program. As far as she could tell, it was an experimental unit that would train soldiers to operate across traditional specialty boundaries, combining technical expertise with combat leadership in ways that had never been attempted before. "The program is voluntary," Colonel Martinez explained, "and it would require an additional 3-year commitment to your service obligation. But graduates would be prepared for leadership positions that don't currently exist in the military structure." As Sarah tried to process all the information she was receiving, she thought about the girl from Ohio who had joined the Army to pay for college and see a bit of the world. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who had no idea what she was capable of accomplishing. "I need to think about these options," Sarah said finally. "It's a lot to consider." "Of course," Harrison replied. "Take all the time you need. But I want you to understand something important, Chun. What you did during that battle wasn't just about saving Major Rodriguez and your fellow soldiers. You demonstrated a new model of military leadership that challenges traditional assumptions about rank, specialization, and command authority." 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in a ceremony hall at the Pentagon, wearing her dress uniform with the Silver Star pinned to her chest. Major Rodriguez, still recovering from his injuries but able to travel, had insisted on attending the ceremony despite his doctor's concerns. The medal ceremony was attended by senior military officials, members of Congress, and Sarah's family, who had flown in from Ohio for the event. Her grandmother, now 82 years old but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. During his speech presenting the award, General Patterson, the Army Chief of Staff, said something that would be quoted in military leadership courses for decades to come. "Private Chin's actions remind us that the most important military operations are not always planned by generals or executed by elite units. Sometimes, the fate of a mission and the lives of our soldiers depend on a single individual's willingness to do what is right, regardless of rank, training, or official responsibility." After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was talking with her family. He was walking with a slight limp, and his right arm was still in a sling, but he looked stronger than she had seen him since before the battle. "Chun," he said, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. But, more than that, I wanted to tell you something I've learned during my recovery." Sarah looked at him expectantly, still feeling slightly overwhelmed by the attention and recognition she had received. "I spent my entire career believing that leadership meant having the right answers and giving the right orders," Rodriguez continued. "But you taught me that sometimes leadership means recognizing when someone else has the better idea, even if they don't have the authority to implement it." Rodriguez paused, choosing his words carefully. "The military is changing, Chun. The challenges we face in the modern world require new kinds of thinking and new approaches to command and control. What you did during that battle wasn't just heroic, it was prophetic. You showed us what the future of military leadership might look like. Sarah had accepted the invitation to join the Integrated Combat Operations Program, and she would begin training in 2 months. The program was still experimental, and there was no guarantee it would succeed or lead to the career opportunities that had been suggested. But Sarah was no longer the uncertain young woman who had worried about proving herself to others. As she stood in the Pentagon Ceremony Hall, surrounded by family, fellow soldiers, and military leaders who wanted to understand how a communications specialist had become a symbol of modern military valor, Sarah realized that the real lesson of that night wasn't about crossing a courtyard under fire or holding off an enemy assault. The real lesson was about the moment when someone decides that other people's lives matter more than their own safety, their career prospects, or their official job description. It was about the recognition that in crucial moments, the most important choice isn't between right and wrong, but between doing something and doing nothing. Major Rodriguez had been wrong about one thing, Sarah thought as she looked around the ceremony hall. The future of military leadership wasn't just about new approaches to command and control. It was about creating an environment where any soldier, regardless of rank or specialty, would be empowered to make the right choice when that choice mattered most. As Sarah's grandmother stood up to congratulate her, the elderly woman whispered something that captured the real significance of everything that had happened. "I always knew you were stronger than you looked, dear. I just didn't know the whole world would figure it out too." The ceremony ended with Sarah being promoted to the rank of sergeant, skipping several normal steps in recognition of her demonstrated leadership capabilities. But as she walked out of the Pentagon that day, Sarah understood that the promotion, the medal, and the recognition were not really about her individual achievements. They were about the military's recognition that courage, leadership, and the willingness to sacrifice for others could emerge from anywhere in the ranks, and that the institution needed to be prepared to recognize and nurture those qualities wherever they appeared. Sarah Chun had rescued her wounded commander amid heavy fire, but what she had really done was demonstrate that the future of military excellence would depend not on rigid hierarchies and predetermined roles, but on creating space for individual soldiers to rise to meet whatever challenges they faced. That night, as Sarah called her parents from her hotel room to share the details of the ceremony, she realized that she was no longer the girl who had left Ohio looking for a way to pay for college. She had become something she had never imagined possible, a soldier whose actions had changed military history, simply by deciding that doing the right thing was more important than following the rules. The story of Private Sarah Chin's rescue mission would be studied in military academies, analyzed by leadership experts, and remembered by soldiers facing their own impossible choices. But for Sarah herself, the most important legacy was the knowledge that when the moment came to choose between safety and sacrifice, she had found the strength to choose sacrifice, and, in doing so, had discovered who she really was. The medics insisted on checking Sarah for injuries, but her wounds were minor compared to what could have happened. As they worked, she watched the helicopters landing to evacuate the wounded and bring in reinforcements to secure the base. Major Rodriguez was loaded onto one of the medical helicopters, still unconscious but stable. Before the aircraft took off, one of the flight medics approached Sarah. "You're the soldier who carried out the rescue mission?" he asked. Sarah nodded, suddenly, feeling very tired. "The major woke up during transport and asked me to tell you something," the medic continued. "He said to tell you that he was wrong about leadership. He said sometimes the best leaders aren't the ones giving orders, but the ones willing to ignore orders when doing the right thing matters more." As the helicopter lifted off into the night sky, carrying Rodriguez toward a field hospital where he would begin his recovery, Sarah realized that this night had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had discovered something about herself that no amount of training could have taught her, and she knew that whatever happened in the rest of her military career, she would never again be the quiet girl who doubted her own strength. Sarah tried to think through their options. They were too far from the base perimeter to make a run for safety, especially with Rodriguez unable to walk. The enemy had them surrounded and was preparing to attack. Their radio communications were limited because she didn't want to give away their exact position. But as she looked at Rodriguez lying unconscious again, and at Jackson and Martinez preparing to defend their position against impossible odds, Sarah realized that there might be one option they hadn't considered. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it might be their only chance to survive. "Jackson," she said, "how long would it take for you and Martinez to carry Major Rodriguez back to the communications center?" Jackson considered the question, mentally calculating the distance and the difficulty of moving a wounded man. "Maybe 5 minutes if we move fast and don't hit any complications." What? Sarah was already forming a plan that seemed crazy even to her. But it might be the only way to save all four of their lives. It would require her to do something that no communications specialist had ever been trained for, something that would either save them all or get her killed in the attempt. "Because," she said, checking the ammunition in her pistol, "I'm going to buy you those 5 minutes." She began moving carefully along the wall of the communications building, staying in the shadows and trying to remain invisible to anyone watching from a distance. Every few steps, she paused to listen for sounds that might indicate enemy positions or movement in her direction. The first 100 meters passed without incident, but as Sarah approached the open area she would need to cross, the intensity of weapons fire increased dramatically. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions, and the sound of bullets striking concrete and metal suggested that several weapons were trained on the courtyard. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and tried to assess the situation. She could see the building where Rodriguez's team was trapped, but reaching it would require crossing approximately 50 meters of open ground under direct fire from multiple enemy positions. This was the moment of truth. Everything up to this point had been preparation, but now Sarah had to decide whether she was really willing to risk her life for her commanding officer. She thought about her family back home, about the life she had planned after her military service, about all the reasons she had to stay safe and let someone else handle this situation. Then, she thought about Rodriguez lying wounded in the darkness, and she knew that there really wasn't a choice at all. Mary's objective was the communications center itself. They understood that if they could knock out the base's ability to call for help and coordinate with other units, the entire position would become vulnerable. Sarah watched through the reinforced windows as explosions grew closer and closer to their building. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons, and several times bullets struck the walls around them. Despite the danger, she continued operating the radios, maintaining contact with headquarters and calling for additional support. The turning point came when Rodriguez received word that enemy forces had broken through the eastern perimeter and were advancing toward the command center. He gathered a small team of soldiers and prepared to lead a counterattack to push them back. As Rodriguez checked his equipment and prepared to leave the communications center, he turned to Sarah and said something that would haunt her for years to come. "If something happens to me out there," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "make sure you get our people home." Sarah felt her throat tighten as she nodded in response. She had never seen Rodriguez look worried before, and his words carried a weight that made her stomach clench with fear. Rodriguez led his team out into the darkness, and Sarah returned to her radios. She could hear the sound of intense fighting moving closer to their position, and she knew that the next few hours would determine whether they survived or became casualties in a conflict that most people back home barely understood. As she worked to coordinate defensive efforts and call for reinforcements, Sarah had no idea that she was about to face the most important decision of her life, one that would test everything she had learned about courage, duty, and what it really means to serve something bigger than yourself.